They have breached the defenses! Run! The camp is lost! Save yourselves! The gunpowder is exploding!
In the sweltering summer of 1683, Europe held its breath. The winds from the east carried more than heat, they carried rumors. Rumors of fire, of conquest, of an empire on the move. Along the Danube, merchants whispered of strange banners gathering in the distance, of cities swallowed whole, of churches reduced to ash. At first, it sounded like fear distorting truth, but then came the refugees, hollow-eyed and silent. Their homes burned, their prayers unanswered. By June, the rumors were flesh and blood. The Ottoman Empire, vast and disciplined, was coming, and its eyes were fixed on Vienna. They didn't come quietly. Kara Mustafa Pasha's army moved like a continent, stretching from horizon to horizon, a swarm of armor and ambition. Vienna, proud capital of the Habsburgs, stood in its path. It had seen wars, seen empires rise and fall, but nothing like this. Nothing this absolute. In its grand halls, fear crept beneath the tapestries. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, packed his robes and fled westward, abandoning his throne to the dust. Behind him, the city was left to its fate, left to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, 36 years old, unyielding, and now the last shield between Europe and the storm. As the first enemy scouts appeared on the horizon, the city turned inwards. Walls were manned, gates were barred, and every man, woman, and child braced for the darkness that had begun to fall. They came not as men, but as a force of nature. Kara Mustafa's army rolled through the Balkans like thunder across open sky. Behind it, silence. Villages leveled, churches desecrated, cities razed or bent into submission. It wasn't just size that terrified Europe, it was precision. Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, moved in lockstep, their discipline carved from centuries of conquest. Sipahi cavalry shimmered in the sun, their armor glinting like scaled serpents as they thundered down roads once thought safe. Tatar horsemen, wild and merciless, spread fear ahead of the army like smoke before fire. Engineers followed not to build, but to dismantle. Their wagons brimmed with timber, tools, and explosives. Trenches would soon scar the land around Vienna. Tunnels would worm beneath its walls. And above all this, beneath a pavilion of red and green, sat Kara Mustafa himself, calm, confident, patient. He believed Vienna would not need to be taken by fire, only surrounded, squeezed, starved into surrender. As his host advanced from Edirne through the Balkans, cities either bent or broke. By July, the Ottoman banners fluttered near the Austrian frontier. The stage was nearly set. For Europe, it was a moment of reckoning. For Vienna, it was the sound of footsteps in the dark. Vienna stood like a candle in the wind, proud, flickering, and alone. On July 7th, Emperor Leopold I abandoned the city, slipping away into the west with his court and his crown. The nobility followed, leaving behind empty estates and unspoken prayers. What remained was a city stripped to its bones, defended by a garrison of barely 15,000 and a citizen militia half that size. And in the heart of this fragile defense stood one man, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, young, unshaken, and iron-willed. The fate of Vienna, and perhaps of Christendom, rested on his shoulders. When the Ottoman vanguard appeared on July 14th, it was not with the crash of cannon, but the creeping silence of inevitability. 3 days later, the city was fully encircled. From the ramparts, Viennese eyes looked out upon a nightmare made real. An ocean of Ottoman tents stretching beyond sight, glinting like silk beneath the summer Sunday. At its center rose the grand pavilion of Kara Mustafa, more palace than tent, with fountains and carpets mocking the battered stones of Vienna's walls. And yet, the city did not tremble. Starhemberg stood tall upon the ramparts, and beneath him, a battered but breathing army of soldiers, bakers, mothers, priests, all ready to fight. Vienna would not fall quietly. Then came the hammer. The first cannonballs struck on a warm July night, tearing into bastions that had stood for generations. From that moment on, the siege became a rhythm of thunder and silence day after day. The Ottomans bombarded the walls. Night after night they dug, tunneled, and waited. Life inside Vienna unraveled. Bread was rationed to crumbs. Water, once drawn from the Danube, was cut off. Disease crept through the alleys like a second invader. Families huddled in cellars beneath trembling ceilings. Churches became hospitals, then morgues. Yet, through it all, the city held. Starhemberg's voice rang from the ramparts like iron striking stone. We do not yield. Every breach the Ottomans blasted was met with rubble, timber, and blood. Civilians passed stones, water, and ammunition hand to hand. Women carried powder to cannons. Boys filled gaps in the wall with their own bodies. Each attack was repelled, not just by soldiers, but by a people unwilling to kneel. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa waited. His siege works pressed closer. His sappers laid mines beneath Vienna's bones. He was patient, believing the city would starve before it would break. But inside those crumbling defenses, something was growing, not despair, but defiance. Time was Kara Mustafa's weapon of choice. He believed that victory wouldn't come from fire or fury, but from silence, the silence that follows starvation. His army encircled Vienna like a noose, tightening each day. Artillery hammered the walls, tunnels crept beneath them, and yet still he waited. He refused to commit his full strength to a final assault, fearing the cost in blood. Instead, he let hunger do the work. Inside Vienna, days blurred into weeks. The bread grew thinner, rats became meals. Children wasted away in the shadows of collapsed homes. But the spirit of the defenders burned hotter with every sunrise. When Ottoman sappers approached, citizens rained down boiling oil and broken glass. When mines blew holes in the bastions, they filled them with whatever they had: stone, wood, flesh. The siege was no longer just a military struggle. It was a test of will. And while Kara Mustafa plotted, believing time was on his side, something else was stirring far beyond the walls. Every blast that shook Vienna echoed into the heart of Europe a call for help, a warning, a plea, and somewhere in the north, a king had already heard it. The thunder of Ottoman cannons may have shattered Vienna's walls, but it was their echo that shook Europe awake. From Rome, Pope Innocent XI did not see a city under siege. He saw Christendom on the edge of extinction. For him, the fall of Vienna would not just be a political collapse, but a spiritual death knell. And so, he acted, not with armies, but with words, gold, and faith. He called upon kings and dukes to set aside rivalries, to unite not as nations but as defenders of a common soul. From papal chambers, letters flew like doves across a continent. And slowly, the tide began to shift. A fractured Europe, long torn by internal conflict and pride, began to stir under a single cause. A holy league was born fragile, hesitant, but real. Yet even among crowns, one voice stood above the rest. A voice not of caution, but conviction. In the far plains of Poland, King John III, Sobieski listened. A warrior king with scars from 100 battles and a gaze fixed on history. He understood the weight of the moment. And when others hesitated, Sobieski saddled his horse. To save Vienna, he said, is to save Poland. His march had begun. From the distant plains of Poland, his eyes turned west. King John III Sobieski, the Lion of Lekistan, did not hesitate. Where emperors fled and nobles argued, he saw only duty. Though his counselors urged caution, fearing for Polish borders, fearing internal strife, Sobieski stood firm. If Vienna falls, he declared, they won't stop there. They'll come for Krakow, for Warsaw. Better we meet them there than on our own soil. It wasn't just words, it was destiny. This wasn't a campaign, it was a crusade. With the Holy League slowly forming Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Sobieski's decision gave the coalition its spine. He was no distant monarch. He had fought alongside his men, sabers drawn, in mud and snow. At Chokim, he'd broken Ottoman lines. Now, he would do it again, not for conquest,
We fight
but for
not for
Christendom.
glory,
His army of
but for the soul of
70,000 marched
Christendom.
across the Danube
For faith,
through heat and
for
hardship,
liberty, for
bound for the
Poland.
ridges above Vienna. Some limped, many were hungry, but all were resolute. Behind them, churches prayed. Ahead, a continent waited. And as the plains of Vienna came into view, Sobieski dismounted, looked upon the battlefield, and whispered not fear, but faith. From the battered towers of Vienna, smoke rose like a prayer. Within the city, Starhemberg and his men clung to the final scraps of strength. Every hour was a battle, every breath defiance. But on the morning of September 10th, eyes on the ramparts widened. Flags moved among the trees. Crosses shimmered on distant hills. Help real, living, armed help had come. Above the city, Sobieski's army stood like a thundercloud ready to break. They had survived a brutal march through forests and mountains, driven not by orders, but by belief. Below them, the Ottoman camp sprawled like a second city, endless tents, siege works, and weapons of war. Between the two forces lay Vienna, bruised and bleeding, but unbroken. Kara Mustafa saw the Allies arrive and remained unfazed. His grip on the city, he believed, was unshakable. His army was still massive, still entrenched. He was confident he could repel the newcomers and crush the city in one swift, final move. But what he didn't see, what he refused to believe, was that Vienna had done its part. It had held the line long enough. Now, the gates of salvation had opened, and the day of reckoning was near.
The main
September
force
11th was a
advances
day of
here.
silence,
It is the
not
only
of
way,
peace,
though the
but of
terrain
preparation.
fights us.
Beneath the dense trees of the Kahlenberg Ridge, Sobieski and his commanders gathered like chess masters before the final move. The terrain was treacherous, thick woods, steep slopes, and narrow paths winding down to the plains. But within that challenge lay their strength. Concealed in the forests were nearly 70,000 Allied troops, Polish lancers, German infantry, Austrian riflemen, and hidden deeper still, in the shadows of the hills, waited a force that would change the course of history. 20,000 cavalry, silent, patient, deadly. Meanwhile, Kara Mustafa solidified his siege lines, confident that even if the Allies attacked, they could not break through. He underestimated the will that had brought these men together. Sobieski, surveying the battlefield, knew there was no room for error. Languages clashed
line
among
won't hold
commanders.
another hour,
Pride
General. We
simmered
must
beneath banners.
retreat.
Yet, under his command,
push through the
they
forest
unified.
pass now, while
In the hush before dawn, Sobieski addressed his troops, not as kings and nobles, but as brothers in arms. This is not a war for borders. It is
Men
a
of
war
Poland,
for our homes,
today we
for our
fight not
faith,
just for
for
our
our
lands,
future.
but for
His
all of
words settled
Christendom.
like steel in their
To
bones.
victory.
The next morning, the storm would break. At dawn on September 12th, the hills around Vienna trembled with movement. The forest canopy above the city stirred not with wind, but with warriors. Below, the Ottoman camp stretched like a living maze, unaware that death had crept to its doorstep. Then came the first shot. Cannons roared. Muskets cracked. The Holy League surged from the tree line, pouring down ridges in waves. On the left flank, Imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine advanced toward the city's northern walls. In the center, German and Austrian units pressed through forested slopes, colliding with startled Ottoman sentries. And from inside the city itself, the defenders launched a desperate sortie, setting Ottoman trenches ablaze, dividing their enemy's focus. Kara Mustafa, startled but still resolute, funneled reinforcements forward. Janissaries responded with iron discipline, their drums thundering like war heartbeats. Cavalry darted across the plains. Tatars wheeled through smoke like ghosts. But the pressure mounted, inch by inch. The Christian alliance pressed forward. Smoke cloaked the battlefield. The scent of powder and sweat and fear clung to every breath. From the ridges to the city gates, war had erupted on all fronts. And through the chaos, one final weapon waited, silent, hidden, watching for the right moment to strike. The battle raged on like a storm refusing to break. By midday, Vienna's plains had become a furnace of fire and steel. Allied lines pushed forward, slow and grinding, clashing with Ottoman defenses that refused to buckle. Janissaries stood like stone unwavering, brutal locking swords with German foot soldiers in the choking smoke. Kara Mustafa hurled wave after wave into the fray. He believed attrition would wear the Allies down, but it wasn't enough. Every advance the Ottomans made was met with twice the fury. From within Vienna, Starhemberg's troops fought like men, already dead, fearless, reckless, burning with the knowledge that this was their last chance. They raided enemy trenches, torched siege engines, sowed confusion where fear already bloomed. The plains groaned under cannon fire, the forests bled musket smoke. Across the battlefield, discipline faltered as exhaustion clawed at men on both sides. And still, the cavalry waited. Sobieski, watching from the ridge, saw what others missed. The Ottoman line was beginning to sag. Not collapse, not yet, but tremble. It was almost time. Almost. All that was needed was one break, one fracture. One opening wide enough for wings to pass through. Then the earth began to shake not from cannon, but from hooves. From the heights of the Columnberg, nearly 20,000 cavalry surged forward like a dam breaking. At their head rode King John III, Sobieski, his sword raised, his eyes fixed on the heart of the Ottoman camp. Behind him thundered the winged hussars, their great feathered wings slicing through wind and legend alike. Armor gleamed like molten silver in the sunday. Lances lowered, banners snapped, and that sound, that unearthly whistle of feathers in motion, it was the sound of doom. The Ottomans looked up in horror. They had spent hours locked in brutal infantry combat, never imagining such a charge could still come. It was too late. The cavalry smashed into their flanks like a divine hammer. Sipahi units shattered. Infantry lines crumbled. Even seasoned janissaries turned in confusion. The Ottomans tried to form ranks. Some even stood their ground, but they were swept aside like reeds in a flood. Sobieski didn't slow. His hussars tore through tents, artillery posts, command banners. It wasn't a charge. It was an exorcism. A force so fast, so furious, it seemed to descend not from hills, but from heaven itself. The Ottoman camp dissolved into chaos. Kara Mustafa's proud army, so vast, so confident at dawn, now buckled under the weight of steel and thunder. Polish hussars crashed into their ranks like a wave of judgment. Sipahi cavalry were torn from their saddles. Artillery crews abandoned their cannons mid-load. Even seasoned veterans dropped their weapons and fled. Sobieski rode at the front, unrelenting, his lance slicing through the smoke like a beacon. Around him, German cuirassiers and Austrian dragoons poured into the breach, widening it with every charge. The Ottoman line, stretched thin and reeling from hours of combat, began to disintegrate. From the city walls, Vienna's defenders watched in awe. What had seemed impossible that morning, deliverance now unfolded before their eyes like divine theater. Cheers rose from crumbling towers, tears rolled down soot-covered faces. Kara Mustafa's command tent, once a symbol of Ottoman power, was now a ruin of trampled silk and scattered maps. The Grand Vizier fled in disgrace, his carefully constructed siege collapsing behind him. What began as a conquest ended as a rout, and at its center, riding through the dust and fire, was the Lion of Poland leading not just men, but a miracle. By nightfall, the plains of Vienna had become a graveyard of ambition. The mighty Ottoman army, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now fled in broken clusters, hunted, scattered, leaderless. Sobieski's forces gave no room to breathe. Every path east was blocked, every river crossing contested. Tatar horsemen galloped wildly, no longer scouts of terror but fugitives. Sipahi units abandoned their banners. Janissaries, stripped of order, vanished into the forests or fell where they stood. The great siege had not merely failed, it had unraveled into catastrophe. And still, the Polish king pressed forward. Discipline held. His troops did not stop for spoils or revenge. Their task was clear: dismantle the threat completely. Behind them, Vienna's citizens poured from the gates. Some wept, some prayed. Others helped drag captured cannons away from the smoking fields. The air reeked of gunpowder, sweat, and spilled dreams. Kara Mustafa's gamble starved the city. Crush the Soul had backfired. Instead, it ignited unity, strategy, and firepower on a scale he never anticipated. The Ottoman banners that once cast shadows over Europe now lay trampled beneath hoof and boot. The gateway to the continent had not only been defended, it had become a wall. The smoke had barely lifted when Vienna roared to life. Joy rang from broken steeples. Church bells, silent for months, now sang like victory itself. In the streets, soldiers embraced civilians. Children danced where cannonballs once fell. And through the heart of the city rode the man who had defied an empire, King John III Sobieski. Flowers rained from balconies. Banners waved. But beneath the celebration pulsed something deeper. Awe. The people had not merely survived, they had witnessed legend. The Polish hussars became myth before sunset, their charge etched into the soul of Europe. Sobieski, crowned by cheers rather than jewels, was hailed not as a conqueror, but as a savior. Yet he asked for no tribute, no throne, only prayers. The city began to rebuild. Fortifications rose anew. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. And across Europe, monarchs who once bickered sent envoys of thanks. The Holy League, once fragile, now stood firm. The siege had ended, but the message echoed far louder than any cannon. Empires may rise on force, but they fall to unity. Vienna, once thought doomed, became a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of a moment when courage, strategy, and faith turned the tide of history.